German artillery officer vanished in 1943. 82 years later, his mountain ammunition cache was found. Hey everyone! Tonight we are stepping deep into the Austrian Alps, into a world of frozen limestone, century-old timber, and secrets that the mountain itself refused to surrender for over 80 years. What began as a routine infrastructure inspection in the summer of 2025 ended up rewriting the official history of a man who was declared dead in 1943 and whose name had not been spoken aloud in any official capacity since the closing months of the Second World War. It started on the morning of July 8, 2025. A maintenance team from the Styrian Regional Roads Authority had been dispatched to a stretch of deteriorating service road in the Gessius Mountains, a dramatic gorge region in northern Styria, Austria, where the Enns River cuts through vertical limestone walls and the forests cling to near-vertical slopes like something out of a painting. Their task was straightforward: assess the stability of a collapsed embankment roughly 2 kilometers above the village of Edmont, a small settlement known primarily for its Benedictine monastery and its position deep within a national park. No archaeological significance, no reason to expect anything extraordinary. The crew foreman, a 47-year-old roads engineer named Stefan Gruber, was directing a small excavator to clear a section of collapsed hillside when the machine's bucket suddenly dropped, not a few centimeters into soft earth, but nearly a full meter into empty space. The operator, Marcus Feldner, 29 years old, immediately cut the engine. The bucket had punched through what appeared to be a thin layer of compacted soil and limestone debris covering a void beneath. Gruber leaned forward, switched on his site inspection torch, and peered into the gap. What he saw stopped him completely. Timber, not fallen timber, not rotted root systems, but deliberately placed, squared-off timber beams, positioned with the unmistakable geometry of engineered reinforcement. Below the beams, visible in the torch beam, darkness, depth, a passage. The Styrian Regional Roads crew did not proceed further. Gruber, experienced enough in Alpine infrastructure to recognize a wartime structure when he saw one. The Austrian mountains contain hundreds of abandoned Wehrmacht fortifications, fuel stores, and command bunkers. Immediately contacted the Austrian Federal Monuments Office. That same afternoon, a preliminary notification was filed with the University of Graz's Institute for Medieval and Modern History, which maintains a standing protocol for exactly this kind of discovery. By the morning of July 10, 2025, Dr. Anna Reisinger, 51, a specialist in Second World War-era Alpine military infrastructure, and her research colleague Dr. Florian Winkler, 38, were on site with ground-penetrating radar equipment, portable LED lighting, and a structural engineer from the Graz Technical University named Paul Hochiger, 44, who had been consulted specifically to assess the safety of the passage before any entry was attempted. The ground-penetrating radar results came back within 3 hours. They were extraordinary. The chamber behind the collapsed entrance measured approximately 22 meters in length and 7 meters in width. The radar signatures showed dense, regular metallic objects arranged in rows, the classic pattern of a military ordnance storage facility. But more intriguing than the ordnance were 3 separate anomalous returns in the rear section of the chamber. Compact, rectangular, dense objects arranged in a deliberate cluster that was inconsistent with any standard military storage pattern. By July 14, 2025, after 4 days of careful structural shoring and entrance excavation, the team made its first physical entry into the chamber. The air inside was cold, still, and dry. The limestone geology had maintained near-perfect preservation conditions. The ordnance was real: 105 artillery shells, Wehrmacht tissue, packed in original wooden crates stenciled with the markings of Feld Artillery Regiment 114, 1st Mountain Division, a unit that had operated in this exact region of Austria during 1943. Dozens of crates, still intact, still potentially live. But the anomalous objects in the rear corner of the chamber were what froze every person in that space. A metal document case, Wehrmacht tissue, sealed and corroded but structurally sound. A second, smaller leather case, cracked but intact. And beneath both, wrapped in oilcloth that had been carefully tied with cord that crumbled at the first touch, a flat wooden box. Opened under controlled conditions at the University of Graz Conservation Laboratory on July 18, 2025, the cases yielded the following: a Wehrmacht officer's soldbuch, the military pay and identification record, bearing the name and photograph of Hauptmann Karl Heinrich Voss, born April 14, 1910, in Innsbruck, Austria. Officer, 3rd Battery, Feldartillery Regiment 114. Officially listed as killed in action near Rostov-on-Don, Soviet Union, on December 3, 1943. His death certificate, issued by the Wehrmacht Personnel Office in February 1944, was held in the German Military Records Bureau in Berlin. Karl Heinrich Voss had been officially dead for 82 years. The wooden box contained a letter dated October 17, 1943, written in precise, educated German. It was addressed to no one. It was signed with initials only, and its opening line, translated from the German, reads as follows: "By the time this is read, I will be living under another name in another country, and the man I was will be as dead as they already believe me to be." If you want to see what investigators discovered when they followed the evidence from that Alpine chamber across 3 countries and 8 decades, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel right now, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. We are going to travel this story together from the mountains of Austria to the shores of Argentina, and everything you are about to hear is reconstructed from forensic evidence, declassified files, and archival records that were only assembled for the first time in 2025. The journey starts here. To understand Karl Heinrich Voss, to understand why a decorated Wehrmacht artillery officer would walk away from the only war he had ever known, seal his identity inside a mountain, and vanish from the official record of the 20th century, you need to understand not just the man, but the world that built him and then systematically destroyed everything he loved within it. Karl Heinrich Voss was born on April 14, 1910, in Innsbruck, the capital of the Austrian Tyrol, a city pressed between mountain ranges and shaped by centuries of its position as a crossroads between the Germanic north and the Italian south. His father, Georg Voss, was a civil engineer who had worked on the construction of several of the Tyrolean Alpine road systems in the early decades of the 20th century. His mother, Clara Voss, née Mayer, was the daughter of a schoolmaster from the Zillertal Valley. The family was educated, moderately prosperous, and rooted in the particular character of Tyrolean Austria, deeply conservative, Catholic in practice though not always in conviction, and possessed of the Alpine man's instinctive relationship with difficult terrain. Karl Heinrich, the eldest of 4 children, showed from boyhood the qualities that would define his military career: an exceptional aptitude for mathematics and structural calculation, a physical confidence in mountain environments that his teachers at the Innsbrucker Gymnasium noted repeatedly, and what his father once described in a private letter as a mind that thinks in 3 dimensions. He does not read a landscape, he calculates it. He was not a gregarious child. He was precise, observant, and possessed of a stubbornness that his mother called determination, and his teachers sometimes called something less flattering. He graduated from gymnasium in 1928 and enrolled at the University of Innsbruck's Faculty of Engineering. For 2 years, he studied structural and civil engineering, excelling particularly in applied mathematics and topographic surveying. But the economic catastrophe of 1929 reached even into the Alpine universities of Austria, and when Georg Voss's engineering firm collapsed in the credit crisis of 1930, Karl Heinrich's tuition could no longer be funded. He withdrew from his degree program in February 1930, and like many technically educated young Austrian men of his generation who found civilian employment closed to them, enlisted in the Austrian Federal Army. He was 20 years old. He was assigned on the basis of his mathematical aptitude and demonstrated familiarity with mountain terrain to an artillery training program at the garrison in Kufstein, a fortress town on the Inn River where Austria meets Bavaria. Here, in the disciplined, technically demanding world of indirect fire calculation and ballistic mathematics, Karl Heinrich Voss found his natural element. His ability to calculate firing solutions mentally, accounting for elevation, temperature, wind, and the specific acoustic and observation challenges of mountain terrain, was noted by his instructor, a veteran of the First World War named Feldwebel Rupert Gattner, who described him in a training assessment held in the Innsbruck Provincial Military Archive as the finest natural artillery brain I have trained in 15 years of instruction. He was promoted to lieutenant in 1933, to Oberleutnant in 1936. He developed, during this period, a secondary expertise that would later prove critical: the engineering and concealment of ammunition storage facilities in mountain terrain. The Austrian army, operating on minimal budgets and under constant political pressure from both Nazi Germany and a domestic fascist movement, was focused during the mid-1930s on the construction of concealed defensive infrastructure. Hidden ammunition caches, dispersed fuel stores, camouflaged artillery positions that could be maintained even if the main garrison positions were overrun or occupied. Voss contributed directly to the design of several such installations in the Styrian and Upper Austrian Alpine zones between 1934 and 1938. This specific expertise, the construction and concealment of underground military storage in alpine limestone terrain, is precisely what the chamber in the Gessius Mountains represents. He did not find that cave by accident. He built it. Following the Anschluss of March 1938, when Austria was absorbed into the Third Reich and the Austrian Federal Army was dissolved and integrated into the Wehrmacht, Voss was assigned with the rank of Hauptmann Captain to Feldartillerie Regiment 114, a unit of the 1st Mountain Division, the elite Gebirgsdivision that would serve in Poland, France, Greece, and ultimately the Eastern Front. His expertise in mountain artillery and his detailed knowledge of alpine defensive engineering made him a valued technical officer. By 1941, FAR 114 was deployed on the Eastern Front as part of Army Group South's operations in Ukraine and the Caucasus region. Voss commanded the 3rd Battery, responsible for fire support across an area of operations that constantly shifted with the grinding advances and retreats of the campaign. He was decorated twice: the Iron Cross Second Class in October 1941, following sustained battery action during the advance toward Rostov-on-Don, and the Iron Cross First Class in August 1942, during the brutal fighting in the approaches to the Caucasus mountain passes. His commanding officer, Oberst Hans Dieter Riemann, 53, described Voss in his fitness report of September 1942 as an officer of exceptional technical competence and unshakable composure under fire, the kind of man upon whom an entire battery depends and who does not, under any circumstances, lose his calculation. That composure was about to be tested in a way that had nothing to do with Soviet artillery. In February 1943, Voss received a letter delayed by the chaotic wartime postal system by nearly 6 weeks that had been written in late December 1942 by his wife's sister, Helene Rayner. The letter informed him that his wife, Elisabeth Voss, née Huber, 30 years old, and their daughter, Margarethe, 4 years old, had been killed on December 19, 1942, when a building collapse resulting from an Allied bombing raid struck the residential street in Innsbruck where they had been living. His son, Werner, 6 years old, had survived because he had been staying with his grandparents in the Zillertal that weekend. Elizabeth and Margaret Voss were buried together in the Westfriedhof Cemetery in Innsbruck. Voss received this information while sitting in a frozen field command post east of Rostov-on-Don, in temperatures that regularly fell below -20 degrees Celsius. The official psychological and behavioral record shows nothing. No breakdown, no incapacity. The War Diary of FAR 114 for February 1943 records Captain Voss performing his duties without interruption. But in the letter found in the Alpine chamber, the letter dated October 17, 1943, Voss himself wrote, "When I read those words in Helene's letter, I did not weep. I did the calculation. I calculated what I was fighting for. I calculated what I would return to. And I calculated, with the same precision I apply to every firing solution, the probability that this war leads anywhere worth surviving for." He was 33 years old. His wife and daughter were dead. His surviving son was being raised by aging grandparents in a mountain valley. And the war, by early 1943 with Stalingrad collapsing, was increasingly legible to an analytically minded officer as a catastrophe in progress. The man who had designed hidden mountain ammunition caches for a living began, quietly, deliberately, to design something far more personal: his own disappearance. The autumn of 1943 was the hinge point of the Eastern Front. Following the German defeat at Kursk in July, the largest tank battle in history, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had permanently shifted to the Soviet Union. Army Group South was in retreat. The units of the 1st Mountain Division, including FAR 114, were being redeployed westward in a series of exhausting withdrawals that placed immense logistical strain on every component of the German war machine. In this environment of accelerating chaos, a careful man with a plan and the right connections could create opportunities that would have been impossible in the ordered advance of 1941. The weeks leading to Voss's disappearance can now be reconstructed with considerable precision from a combination of regimental war diaries, declassified Abwehr operational files, and the physical evidence recovered from the Alpine chamber. October 1, 1943. FAR 114 is withdrawn from forward positions in southern Ukraine and begins a westward movement by rail. The regiment is scheduled for a period of rest and refit at a staging area in Slovakia before redeployment. Voss's 3rd Battery is documented in the regimental war diary as having completed the withdrawal in good order. October 4, 1943. The regiment reaches the staging area near Bratislava, Slovakia. Officers are granted limited leave authorizations for the rest period. Voss applies for and receives a 5-day leave authorization to travel to Innsbruck, officially to visit his surviving son Werner and attend to personal family matters. The leave authorization, numbered 114 FAR 3 BTTR 1943 L047, is signed by Oberst Riemann. This document exists in the German Federal Military Archive. This leave authorization is genuine. What Voss does with it is not what Riemann authorized. October 5, 1943, at approximately 6 a.m., Voss departs the Bratislava staging area by military transport to Vienna. His movement is logged in the regimental departure record. From Vienna, he is documented on a rail passenger manifest as traveling southwest toward Salzburg, which was the appropriate route for a journey to Innsbruck. He checked into a Wehrmacht transit billet in Salzburg on the evening of October 5th, arriving at around 8 p.m. So far, everything is consistent, with a man traveling home on authorized leave. What happens next is not in any official record. It is reconstructed from the contents of the Alpine chamber, from a post-war interview transcript located in the Austrian State Archive in November 2025, and from a set of Abwehr operational files declassified in 2019 that were cross-referenced with the Voss case by Dr. Winkler's research team in August 2025. October 6, 1943. Voss does not continue to Innsbruck. Instead, he travels east from Salzburg into the Salzkammergut, the Lake District of Upper Austria and Styria, by local train and then on foot. His destination was a small farmstead above the town of Edmont called the Einerderhof, a remote, seasonal agricultural property that sat at an elevation of approximately 1,100 meters in the forest above the Jessius Gorge. The Einerderhof was owned by a man named Georg Fandelbauer, 61 years old, a former Austrian Federal Army logistics sergeant who had served alongside Voss in the same unit in 1934 and 1935. Fandelbauer was, investigators now know from the declassified Abwehr files, an active contact in an informal network of former Austrian military personnel who had quietly maintained relationships with former Abwehr officers following the Anschluss, men who had positioned themselves, with the careful pragmatism of people who had survived one regime change already, for what they believed was an inevitable second one. October 6, 1943, at around 3 p.m., Voss arrives at the Einerderhof. He is met by Fandelbauer and, crucially, by a second individual identified in the post-war interview transcript as the document man, a figure who is identified in the Abwehr files by the operational pseudonym Falk, the German word for falcon. Falk's real identity was, investigators discovered in October 2025, a Swiss-born commercial printing professional named Ernst Holliger, 44, who had been producing high-quality forged identity documents for the Abwehr's stay-behind networks since 1941. Holliger was based in Basel, but traveled periodically into Austria for exactly this purpose. At the Einerderhof between October 6 and October 8, 1943, Karl Heinrich Voss ceased to exist on paper. Holliger provided Voss with a complete set of Swiss civilian identity documents in the name of one Karl Steinor, born April 14, 1910, in Zurich, same birth date, different everything else, a Swiss residence registration card, a work history document showing employment as a surveyor and civil engineer in Zurich and Basel, a passport, technically neutral Swiss, bearing Voss's photograph and Steinor's name and biographical details. The quality of these documents, examined by the Forensic Document Analysis Team at the University of Graz in September 2025, was described as exceptional, consistent with the highest-grade forgeries produced during the war period, comparable in quality to known Abwehr operational documentation. October 8, 1943, at around 10 p.m., under cover of darkness, Voss made the journey from the Einerderhof to the Alpine chamber he had personally supervised the construction of during his engineering work for the Austrian Federal Army in 1936. The chamber had been built as a concealed ammunition reserve for a defensive position that was never used and had been largely forgotten in the reorganization following the Anschluss. Voss had retained, in his own memory, both the location of the chamber and the fact that it contained, from its original construction, several hundred rounds of 105 artillery ammunition that had been placed there in 1937 and never recovered. It was to this chamber that Voss brought his Wehrmacht Soldbuch, his personal photograph, the letter he had written, and a wooden box. That box, opened at the University of Graz Conservation Laboratory on July 18, 2025, contained something that would ultimately allow investigators to trace his entire subsequent life. It contained 32 gold coins, Austrian ducats and German Reich gold marks, totaling a market value in 1943 of approximately 15,000 Reichsmarks, enough to fund a journey from Austria to South America several times over. It also contained a coded map, hand-drawn by Voss himself on paper so thin it had survived the decades, folded to the size of a postage stamp, showing a network of waypoints running from the Jessius Mountains southward through the Styrian Alps, across the border into Yugoslavia, and ultimately to the Adriatic coast. On the sealed document case, scratched into the metal with something small and sharp, was a single word, Steinor. October 9, 1943, at approximately 2 a.m. Voss sealed the chamber entrance with a precision that reflected his engineering training, disguising the access point with collapsed limestone debris arranged to mimic natural erosion. He left the mountain carrying nothing but his forged Swiss identity, the gold coins distributed in a concealed money belt, and the coded map memorized. He destroyed the physical copy of the map, keeping only the version he had scratched in simplified form into the document case for whoever someday might find it. He never reported back to FAR 114. On October 14, 1943, when his leave authorization expired and he failed to return to the Bratislava staging area, he was logged as absent without leave. By October 20th, with no communication and no trace of his whereabouts, the regimental administration began the formal missing person process. On December 3, 1943, the date ultimately chosen for his official death record, Oberst Riemann signed the formal declaration listing Voss as killed in action, citing a plausible but entirely fabricated engagement near Rostov-on-Don, consistent with the regiment's operational history in that theater. Karl Heinrich Voss was declared dead at 33 years of age. The war diary moved on. The casualty lists were already impossibly long. July 18, 2025. The Conservation Laboratory at the University of Graz is a long, high-ceilinged room with the particular atmosphere of a space dedicated to extreme patience, controlled humidity, filtered lighting, the barely audible hum of climate management systems. Dr. Anna Reisinger stands at the central examination table wearing nitrile gloves, and in front of her, laid out on acid-free archival cotton, are the contents of a document case that has not been opened in 82 years. The investigation that follows is one of the most meticulously documented forensic historical inquiries conducted in Austria since the discovery of the Alta-Sea salt mine art repository was fully investigated in the 1990s. It involves 3 universities, 2 national archives, an international team of forensic document specialists, and ultimately the cooperation of the Argentine National Archives in Buenos Aires. And it begins, as so many revelations do, with a single piece of paper. The Soldbuch, the Wehrmacht Pay Book, is the first object subjected to full forensic analysis. Dr. Winkler's preliminary visual examination on July 18th identifies it as genuine. The paper stock, the typeface, the regimental stamps, and the ink composition are all consistent with authentic Wehrmacht Soldbuch production of the 1940-1944 period. The photograph affixed inside shows a man of early middle age, lean-featured, clean-shaven, with deep-set eyes and the precisely combed hair of a Wehrmacht officer's official portrait. This photograph is cross-referenced on July 22, 2025, against the partial records held in the Austrian Military History Museum in Vienna, which maintains a photographic archive of former Austrian Federal Army officers. The match is confirmed by facial recognition analysis conducted by the forensic imaging team of the Vienna Institute of Forensic Medicine. This is Karl Heinrich Voss, Hauptmann, FAR 114. The man in the photograph and the man in the army records are the same person. Certainty level, 94%. But the document case also contains something the Soldbuch does not: a set of forged Swiss identity papers in the name of Karl Steinor. These papers are photographically identical to the man in the Soldbuch. Forensic document analyst Dr. Petra Grunwald, 49, of the Austrian Criminal Intelligence Service's Historical Documents Unit, examines both sets of documents on July 25, 2025, and files a technical report that becomes a cornerstone of the investigation. Her findings are unambiguous. The Swiss identity documents are of wartime Abwehr network production quality, consistent with known examples of Abwehr-facilitated identity forgery. The paper, the ink, the typeface, the official stamps All are from the 1943–1944 production period. The photograph in the Swiss documents matches the photograph in the Soulbuch identically, taken at the same sitting. One man, two identities, one of them officially dead for 82 years. The letter, extracted from the document case and translated in full by July 20, 2025, provides the narrative thread that transforms scattered evidence into a coherent story. Written in the measured, precise German of an educated technical man, it reads not as confession but as calculation, a man explaining to himself, in writing, the logic of what he is doing. It references Elizabeth and Margaret, confirming the personal tragedy. It references the men who sent us here, without specifying who, in a way that suggests a careful awareness of the document's potential discovery. And it contains, in its final paragraph, a set of seemingly cryptic references to locations that would take investigators 3 weeks to decode. The Shepherd's Valley holds the first gate. The stone bridge at the river town holds the second. The harbor of the three churches holds the third and the last. Dr. Winkler, working with historical geographer Dr. Sophie Mayer, 43, of the University of Salzburg, cracks the code by August 12, 2025. The Shepherd's Valley, the Ramsau am Dachstein, a remote alpine farming valley in Styria. The stone bridge at the river town, Brücken der Mur, where an old stone bridge crosses the Mur River. The harbor of the three churches, Ravenj, on the Istrian coast of what is now Croatia, a medieval coastal town whose distinctive skyline features 3 prominent church towers, and which in 1943 was part of the Italian-administered territory of Istria. The escape route, as it reveals itself through the coded letter, and the simplified map scratched into the document case, ran from the Gesius Mountains through the Styrian Alps, across the Yugoslav border into Slovenia, through the Istrian Peninsula to the Adriatic coast at Ravenj, and from there, by boat, to a connection point on the Italian side of the Adriatic. From Italy, the route of the wider network led ultimately south, and for many of its users, across the Mediterranean toward North Africa and eventually South America. This is the route of a man who planned meticulously, who knew the terrain, who had already been building concealed infrastructure in these mountains for a decade, and who possessed the navigational and topographic skills to execute a solo journey through difficult terrain in autumn conditions. But the critical question, where did he go after Ravenj, and is there any evidence that he actually survived the journey and the subsequent decades, requires the investigation to look much further afield. The breakthrough comes on September 3, 2025, when Dr. Reisinger contacts the Argentine National Identification Archive in Buenos Aires, operating through the Austrian Federal Foreign Ministry. She submits a formal request under the bilateral Cultural Heritage Cooperation Agreement between Austria and Argentina, an agreement that has been used previously in the repatriation of art stolen during the Nazi period, for any records associated with the name Karl Steinor, Austrian or Swiss national, potentially arriving in Argentina between 1944 and 1950. The Argentine Archive's response arrives on September 19, 2025, and it is, in Reisinger's own words in her published preliminary report, the moment the entire puzzle locked into place. The Argentine National Registry of Foreigners, the Registro Nacional de las Personas, shows a Karl Steinor, Swiss national born April 14, 1910, in Zurich, who registered as a legal resident of the province of Cordoba, Argentina, on March 12, 1946. His stated profession, civil and structural engineer. His employer of record, a construction company based in the city of Cordoba called Empresa Constructora Andina, the Andean Construction Company. His registered address was a rented property in the Villa Belgrano district of Cordoba, a neighborhood that, by 1946, was already becoming known as a destination for German-speaking European immigrants. He was not alone in Villa Belgrano, but that belongs to a later section of this story. In parallel with the Argentine archive research, the investigation pursues a second critical evidentiary thread: DNA analysis. The wooden box containing the gold coins also contained, pressed between two sheets of paper at the very bottom, a small object that Reisinger almost missed: a lock of hair, tied with a thin piece of silk ribbon, with a handwritten label reading in German, M. September 1942. This is, investigators conclude with near certainty, a lock of hair from Margaret Voss, Karl Heinrich's daughter, cut approximately 3 months before her death in December 1942. The hair is submitted for mitochondrial DNA analysis at the Vienna Institute of Forensic Medicine on August 2, 2025. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited through the maternal line, can be extracted from historical hair samples with reasonable reliability and compared against living maternal line descendants. The maternal line descendant in question is located through records research in the Innsbruck Civil Registry by Dr. Mayer's team on August 8, 2025. Werner Voss, Karl Heinrich's surviving son, born June 12, 1937, died in Innsbruck on January 4, 2018 at the age of 80. Werner had 2 daughters, Renate Voss Hartmann, 61 years old, living in Innsbruck, and Claudia Vossegger, 58, living in Feldkirch in the Vorarlberg. Both women share the maternal line mitochondrial DNA of their father Werner, and through him, of Werner's mother Elizabeth, the same maternal line as Margaret, Werner's sister, who died in 1942. Both Renate and Claudia are contacted by Dr. Reisinger's team on August 15, 2025. Both agree to provide DNA samples for comparative analysis. Both, according to the published account, react to the initial contact with what Reisinger describes as a complicated mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that looked very much like the recognition of a possibility they had perhaps already half considered. It emerges, in subsequent interviews conducted by the research team, that both women had grown up with a family tradition, passed down from their father Werner, who had it from his grandmother Clara Voss, that Karl Heinrich had not actually died in Russia but had gone somewhere else. No details, no evidence, just the quiet persistence of a family memory that refused to entirely accept the official story. The mtDNA comparison results, published in the forensic report dated September 10, 2025, confirm a match between the hair sample from the wooden box and both Renate and Claudia. The hair is from a maternal line relative of Werner Voss. It is, with overwhelming probability, from Margaret Voss, the daughter of Karl Heinrich. The official record says Karl Heinrich Voss died in Russia in December 1943. The evidence tells a different story, and that story is just beginning. The network that Karl Heinrich Voss used to disappear was not created for him. He was one user of a system that had been operating since at least 1941, and that would continue to function until approximately 1950. Understanding this network requires stepping back from the individual story and examining the infrastructure that made it possible. Because without that infrastructure, a Wehrmacht captain with forged Swiss papers and a belt full of gold ducats would have been caught and shot within a week. The network is identified in the declassified Abwehr operational files, specifically in a set of internal Abwehr reports from 1942 and 1943, released by the German Federal Intelligence Service in a partial declassification in 2019, under the operational designation Netzwerk Alpine Violet, or Network Alpine Violet. It was not, despite its Abwehr connections, strictly an Abwehr operation. It had begun as an informal arrangement among former Austrian Federal Army officers who had been absorbed into the Wehrmacht after the Anschluss and who, retaining their pre-war relationships and their specific knowledge of the Austrian Alpine terrain, had quietly established a series of safe houses and transit points in the mountain regions of Austria, Slovenia, and Istria. the network's primary architect, investigators determined in October 2025, was a former Austrian Army logistics colonel named Friedrich Leubel, 67 in 1943, who had retired from active service in 1938 and was living, nominally as a farmer, at a property near the town of Leoben in Styria. Leubel had spent his career building and maintaining supply infrastructure in the Austrian Alps and possessed both the geographic knowledge and the pre-existing relationships with rural property owners, farmers, foresters, innkeepers, to construct a functioning underground transit system across terrain that, in autumn and winter conditions, was genuinely treacherous for anyone who did not know it intimately. The network operated on a cell structure. Each segment of the route was managed by a single contact who knew only the two adjacent contacts, the person who delivered travelers to them and the person to whom they passed them on. No single member of the network knew the complete route. This operational security measure, borrowed from resistance network doctrine, meant that the capture of any individual cell member could not compromise the entire system. The Austrian segment of the route ran as follows, reconstructed from the Abwehr files, the coded map from the Alpine chamber, and physical evidence gathered during site investigations conducted by Dr. Reisinger's expanded research team between August and November 2025. Waypoint 1. The Einarderhof above Edmont, Styria. This was the staging point where travelers received their forged documents and initial support. Georg Fandelbauer's farmstead, sitting above the tree line and accessible only by foot in poor weather, served as the network's most northern safe house for the Austrian segment. Investigators visited the site in August 2025. The farmstead is now a ruin, but the building's foundations and the remains of a concealed cellar storage area are clearly visible, consistent with its use as a document storage and supply cache. Waypoint 2. A forester's station near Triben, in the Upper Mur Valley. The forester responsible for this station in 1943 was identified as Awa Riitra, 52, who had served in the same pre-war engineering unit as Friedrich Leubel. Rieitra's denazification file, held in the Styrian Provincial Archive, makes a curious and unexplained reference to dealings with unknown foreign persons during the autumn of 1943, which his denazification panel dismissed as unsubstantiated. In light of the Voss investigation, this reference takes on new significance. Waypoint 3. A rural guest house in the Mur Valley town of Judenburg. The Gasthof Hirschenwert, still operating today as a family-owned inn, was in 1943 run by a widow named Maria Noss, 48, whose husband had been killed in Poland in 1939. Noss provided a bed, a meal, and the next set of travel instructions to network travelers. She is referenced in the Abwehr files under the pseudonym, the Widow of Judenburg. Waypoint 4. A border crossing point in the Karawanken Mountains on the Austrian-Slovenian border. The Karawanken Range forms the natural border between Styria and what was, in 1943, the German-occupied territory of Carniola, part of the broader occupation zone that the Third Reich had carved from the former Yugoslavia. The crossing point used by the network was a high pass, accessible only to experienced mountain walkers, that was not patrolled by German border security forces due to its extreme difficulty and the belief that it was impassable in autumn conditions. Voss, with his Alpine background and technical orientation, would have had no difficulty with this crossing. Waypoint 5. Ljubljana, Slovenia, then called Laibach under German occupation. In Ljubljana, the network maintained contact with a community of Slovenian Catholic clergy who were, quietly and at considerable personal risk, facilitating the movement of people they considered refugees through their monastery network. The specific contact was a Franciscan monk identified in Abwehr files only as Brother K. His full identity has not been confirmed by investigators, and the Franciscan Order's own archives, consulted by the research team in November 2025, have thus far not yielded a definitive identification. Waypoint 6, the Istrian coastal town of Ravenj, then under Italian fascist administration. From Ljubljana, travelers moved southwest through Slovenia into Istria, reaching the Adriatic coast at Ravenj. Here, a network of Italian fishing boat operators, men who had been running contraband across the Adriatic for decades, and for whom political neutrality was simply the cost of professional survival, provided maritime transport across the Adriatic to the Italian port of Pescara, on the opposite coast. From Pescara, the route connected to a broader network, one that historians will recognize as related to, if not identical with, the so-called Ratlins, the escape routes used by former Nazi officials and collaborators in the post-war period to flee Europe for South America and the Middle East. In the specific case of Voss and others who used the Alpine Violet network, the connection point in Italy appears to have been the city of Genoa, where a community of wartime intermediaries, including, according to investigators, at least 2 Argentinian diplomats whose names appear in sealed Argentine Foreign Ministry records that have not been fully declassified, facilitated the issuance of International Committee of the Red Cross travel documents to individuals presenting as displaced persons. The ICRC travel document issued in the name of Karl Steinor, Swiss national, in Genoa in January 1946, located in the Argentine National Archive records, is the final link in the chain. By March 1946, Steinor Voss was registered in Cordoba, Argentina, with a job and address, and a new life constructed with the precision and patience of a man who had spent his career building things designed to endure. Investigators estimate that between 40 and 60 individuals used the Alpine Violet network between 1943 and 1949. Not all were ordinary soldiers. The Abwehr files reference, in guarded language, the transit of at least 3 individuals whose wartime roles placed them in categories of potential war crimes investigation. Their identities have not been fully confirmed, and the research team has referred these references to the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen for further investigation. Karl Heinrich Voss lived in Argentina as Karl Steinor for at least 30 years. The documentary evidence for this portion of his life is fragmentary but revealing, assembled piece by piece from Argentine civil records, the testimony of local historians in Cordoba, and a remarkable private archive discovered in November 2025. From 1946 to approximately 1964, Steinor Voss worked as a civil and structural engineer for Empresa Constructora Andina in Cordoba. His employment records, obtained from the Argentine Labor Registry Archive in Buenos Aires, show a steady professional career. He was involved in the construction of several roads and bridge projects in the Cordoba mountain region, the Sierras de Cordoba, a landscape of modest but genuine mountains that investigators note would have been immediately familiar and comforting to a man from the Tyrolean Alps. He was, by the account of a retired Cordoba civil engineer named Roberto Sandoval, 83, interviewed by the research team via video conference in October 2025. A very private man, very precise in his work, excellent with surveying and calculation, not someone who spoke much about himself, but friendly, not cold. He spoke good Spanish with a heavy German accent that he always said was Swiss. Sandoval had worked briefly alongside Steinor Voss as a young apprentice engineer in 1963 and 1964. He remembered him as a man, already quite old in the way he carried himself, though he was perhaps only in his mid-50s. He remembered a man who worked long days, who walked in the mountains on weekends, and who occasionally, after a long day in the field, would sit alone in the site cabin with a glass of wine and what Sandoval could only describe as a very faraway look. In 1964, the trail goes briefly cold. Steinor Voss's employment records with Impresa Constructora and in Assis in December 1964. A change of address registration, filed in the Cordoba Provincial Registry, shows him moving from Villa Belgrano to a smaller property in the Punilla Valley, northwest of the city, near the town of Villa Carlos Paz. This is a small resort and retirement community, and the property, a single-story house with a garden backing onto the lower slopes of the Sierra Chica, was registered in Steinor's name as owner, suggesting he had accumulated enough capital through his engineering career to purchase property outright. The most extraordinary evidence of what Voss was doing in these final years comes from the private archive discovered in November 2025 by the Argentine component of Dr. Reisinger's research team, working in cooperation with the Cordoba Municipal Historical Archive. In the archive of a Cordoba Catholic parish, San Pedro Apostol in the Villa Belgrano district, a collection of personal papers donated to the parish by a deceased parishioner in the mid-1980s was located in an uncatalogued box. The donation had been made anonymously. The papers included, among other things, 12 letters. The letters were written in German. They were addressed to Werner, my son, but bore no postal addresses and had never been sent. They were drafts or copies retained by the writer. They are dated between 1955 and 1973. They constitute, in aggregate, a deeply private and emotionally complex document. A father writing to a son he has never seen since 1943, explaining nothing of the practical details of where he was or who he was living as, but writing about the mountains, about mathematics, about the memories of the boy's mother Elizabeth, and in several letters about Margaret, the daughter who had died. One letter, dated December 19, 1962, exactly 20 years after the bombing raid that killed Elizabeth and Margaret, is a single page of dense, careful handwriting that concludes with the words, "I know what you would think of me if you knew everything. I have calculated that too. I have no answer that satisfies the calculation." The letters were never sent. Werner Voss, who died in Innsbruck in 2018 without, as far as his daughters knew, ever having had any communication from his father after 1943, never read them. He spent his life, his daughters told the research team in a recorded interview on September 25, 2025, believing his father was dead, occasionally wondering if the family rumor of survival was true, and ultimately making peace with the uncertainty as old men sometimes do. Handwriting analysis conducted on the letters by forensic document specialist Dr. Grunwald in October 2025, comparing them against the letter found in the Alpine chamber and against a handwriting sample from Voss's authenticated 1942 regimental documents, confirms with high probability that all documents were written by the same person. The Argentine Civil Registry shows that Carl Steinor died on August 9, 1978, in Villa Carlos Paz, Cordoba Province, Argentina. He was 68 years old. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. He was buried in the local municipal cemetery under the name Carl Steinor, Swiss national. His grave still exists. It bears no photograph and no biographical inscription, only his name and the dates 1910-1978. What remains unknown, whether he ever made contact with Werner in any form that has yet been discovered, whether he knew, in his final years, that the letters he had written and never sent were sitting in a parish archive a few kilometers from where he lived, and whether, in those last years in the Punilla Valley with its modest mountain views, he had found anything resembling peace. Karl Heinrich Voss was not a war criminal. This is the conclusion of every investigator and historian who has examined the assembled evidence, and it is a conclusion worth stating clearly, because the story of his escape exists in proximity to a history, that of the Nazi Ratlins and the evasion of justice by genuine perpetrators, that demands careful moral distinction. The evidence shows no involvement by Voss in war crimes, atrocities, or any form of criminal conduct beyond the act of desertion from the Wehrmacht in October 1943. His military record, examined against the documented history of FAR 114's operations, shows an officer who fought in a brutal war and fought it within the moral constraints available to him in his position, professionally. He was not a member of the SS. He was not involved in the occupation administrations that carried out systematic persecution and murder in the East. He was an artillery officer who calculated firing solutions and maintained battery readiness, and who, at some point in the winter of 1942 to 1943, decided that the Germany he had been conscripted to serve was not worth dying for. But acknowledging that Voss was not a war criminal is not the same as excusing what he did, nor is it the same as ignoring the moral complications of his escape. The Alpine Violet network that facilitated his disappearance was not exclusively used by ordinary soldiers. The Abwehr files reference at least 3 individuals whose wartime roles merit serious investigation, and whose use of the same escape infrastructure raises profoundly uncomfortable questions. If Voss knew, and an intelligent, connected man in his position likely had some awareness, that the network he was using also moved individuals with much heavier histories, his use of it implicates him in an infrastructure of impunity that served genuine criminals as well as disenchanted soldiers. There is a deeper moral question here, one that historians of the war's aftermath have wrestled with since the Nuremberg trials, and that this case brings into particular focus. At what point does personal grief justify the abandonment of collective accountability? Voss had lost his wife and daughter. The war was visibly lost. His survival instinct and his technical capability combined to produce an extraordinary plan. And yet, in executing that plan, he abandoned his surviving son, Werner, to a childhood without a father, and he did so deliberately, choosing his own survival and freedom over the boy's need for a parent. Werner Voss grew up in Innsbruck, raised by grandparents with a father officially dead in Russia. He became a school teacher. He married. He had 2 daughters. He died at 80, never having known that the unsent letters existed, never having known that his father had lived to 68 in Argentina, thinking about him in careful, private German prose. The daughters, Renate and Claudia, are alive today, and in their recorded testimony for the research team, they speak of a complicated, multi-layered grief, not for a grandfather they never knew, but for their father Werner, who deserved better than an absence that was chosen rather than caused. The victims of the war Heinrich Voss helped prosecute, the Soviet soldiers and civilians who fell under his battery's fire, are not individually named in any document associated with this case. They rarely are. They exist in the casualty statistics of the Eastern Front, in the mass graves and the village memorial lists of a campaign that killed more people than any other single theater of the Second World War. Voss did not pull triggers. He set coordinates. In the mathematics of the Eastern Front, this distinction is technically meaningful and morally insufficient. How many others escaped as he did? The Alpine Violet network's estimated 40 to 60 users represent a fraction of the total number of individuals who used similar underground routes during and after the war. Historians estimate that several thousand former German and Austrian military personnel successfully evaded the post-war denazification process and identification procedures through false identities and clandestine emigration. The vast majority were, like Voss, ordinary soldiers rather than exceptional criminals, and yet their collective evasion contributed to a culture of non-accounting, of closed books and convenient deaths that allowed genuine criminals to shelter within the same statistical mass. The ledger of the Second World War, 80 years after its end, is still not fully settled, and the mountain above Edmont, which kept Heinrich Voss's secrets for 82 years, is a reminder of how many similar ledgers may still be waiting, sealed behind limestone and silence. The chamber above Edmont is not open to the public yet. As of December 2025, it remains a controlled archaeological and forensic site, with the original ordnance still in place pending safe disposal by the Austrian Interior Ministry's bomb disposal unit. The documents and personal effects have been transferred to permanent archival custody at the Austrian State Archive in Vienna, where they will be preserved under controlled conditions and made available to qualified researchers. The plans have been announced by the Austrian Federal Monuments Office in cooperation with the municipality of Edmont and the Jesús National Park Authority for a small interpretive memorial to be established at the site. Not a monument to Karl Heinrich Voss, and not a condemnation of him either. A memorial, in the considered phrasing of the project proposal, to the complexity of individual lives within historical catastrophe, to what mountains hold, and to what they eventually yield. Dr. Reisinger stood at the chamber entrance on a cold afternoon in late November 2025, her breath visible in the alpine air, the valley of Edmont far below her, and the limestone walls of the Jesús Gorge rising beyond. In an interview recorded for the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation on that day, she said, "I have spent my career documenting what people hid and what people left behind. And what strikes me standing here is not the military objects, not the ammunition or the document case. It is the lock of hair. The hair of a little girl who died in 1942, carried to a mountain in Austria by her father and left there for 82 years. That is not a soldier's calculation. That is grief. And grief, it turns out, has a very long half-life." Renate Voss Hartmann visited the chamber site on December 3, 2025, the same date, 82 years earlier, that the Wehrmacht had officially recorded her grandfather as killed in action. She brought a photograph of her father Werner at around the age of 6, taken sometime before the war. She placed it inside the entrance to the chamber, against the limestone wall, and stood there for several minutes without speaking. Whatever passed through her mind during those minutes belongs only to her. The gold coins recovered from the wooden box have been deposited with the Austrian National Bank pending a decision on their final disposition, which will involve consultation with the Voss family descendants. The forged Swiss identity documents have been submitted as evidence to the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, which maintains the world's most comprehensive archive of wartime identity records and missing persons cases. The Karl Steinor alias, now confirmed as Karl Heinrich Voss, will be formally resolved in the ITS database, one less ghost in the vast registry of the disappeared. In Villa Carlos Paz, Argentina, the grave of Karl Steinor still stands in the municipal cemetery. The stone, weathered by 47 Argentine winters, bears no photograph. Dr. Reisinger's team visited in October 2025, took photographs and documented the site. Whether a correction to the grave's inscription will ever be made, whether the name Karl Heinrich Voss will ever formally replace Karl Steinor on that stone, is a decision that belongs to the family, and one they say they have not yet made. There are estimated to be more than 500 unresolved missing persons cases from the Second World War still held in the German Military Records Bureau in Berlin, cases where the documentation is incomplete, the circumstances unverified, and the question of whether the declared death represents a genuine casualty or a deliberate disappearance remains open. The Alpine Violet network was one mechanism. There were others. The Ratlins carried thousands. The false identities embedded themselves in civil registries across 4 continents. The mountains kept their secrets in caves and sealed chambers, and beneath limestone shelves that held, for decade after decade, the weight of choices made under unbearable pressure. Sometimes the mountains keep secrets for 82 years, and when they finally give them up, the secrets do not yield simple stories. They yield human ones, complicated, irresolvable, haunted by the distance between what was official and what was true, between what the record declared and what actually happened in the frozen dark of a long war's worst winter. Somewhere in another valley, beneath another ridge, there may be another sealed door. Another document case, another name written on forged paper, another lock of hair wrapped in silk. The mountains are still holding their last calculations, and we are still, slowly, learning to read them.